Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my guest, Moin Rabbani. Hi, Moin. Thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me, Nassim. It's good to be with you again.
So, a lot's happened this week, and we'll try and cover as much as we can. With the Security Council resolution for a ceasefire, there was a Al Jazeera documentary on 7 October. So I want to ask Moin about his key takeaways from that documentary. We'll also cover the preeminent global institution monitoring famine, just warned that starvation in Gaza uh, is imminent, and how significant is that? With Canada halting arms sale, Blinken warning of Israel's isolation in the world. So we will be asking if there has been a recalibration of Western position with regards to Israel. And after months of ceasefire resolution failing at the UN, partly because of US vetoing, after 170 days yesterday and the death of 32,000 Palestinians, finally the Security Council voted on a ceasefire. So I'll get more thoughts on that. And also, we'll be looking into a new US bill that's been passed, threatening to defund the Palestinian Authority if it actively supports prosecution of Israelis in the International Criminal Court. And we'll end with a discussion about the recent terror attack in Moscow and basically the dangers and of connecting ISIS with Hamas. What are the um, errors and the dangers of doing that? So let's begin with the Al Jazeera documentary, Moin. It's been a while. I think many people have been anticipating a documentary by Al Jazeera. What was your key takeaway from the hour-long documentary?
Well, I think it's probably the most accurate picture that has thus far been made available about what did and what didn't happen on October 7th, based on interviews with a wide array of people from the different parties and different perspectives, and so on. My key takeaways are, first of all, that as we suspected, the Israeli military and intelligence services did collapse like a house of cards on October 7th. There were several senior Israeli officials who suggested that Israel did in fact have sufficient evidence to prevent the attacks on October 7th, but for a variety of reasons having to do with Israeli hubris and policy and assumptions, failed to prevent them. That part I didn't find entirely convincing. My view remains that apart from some minor signals from junior people in the food chain immediately before the attacks, Israel simply had no intelligence and no clue about what was coming. Second of all, I think the documentary made very clear what Hamas's purpose was, which was primarily to overrun the Gaza division, that division of the Israeli military, which is primarily responsible for maintaining the blockade of the Gaza Strip and keeping Palestinians in Gaza in their place. Third of all, I think it also makes clear for those who would still have doubts that there were indeed atrocities perpetrated by Palestinians on October 7th against civilians, and it gave even visual evidence for this. And in addition to that, I think there were two important points that in at least some cases, Israeli civilians were killed inadvertently or deliberately by Israeli forces, either in crossfire, where they were seeking to regain control of territory that had been seized by Hamas, or in implementation of the Hannibal Directive, which is a Israeli principle that a dead Israeli is better than an Israeli captive in Palestinian hands. And the other, I think a lot of people will also be paying attention to this, is that the most lurid Israeli atrocity stories are essentially war propaganda concocted out of thin air and fabricated for deliberately political purposes in order to expand the uncritical Western support for the genocidal assault on the Gaza Strip that came after. So, on the whole, I found it to be a very thorough, well-researched, well-presented, comprehensive, and on the whole, accurate presentation of what did, and as importantly, what did not transpire on the 7th of October, 2023.
What was interesting for me is how they ignored the human rights, the attack on civilians and the human rights abuse that did take place, and ignoring that completely for the fabrication of the 40 beheaded babies and allegations of rape being weaponized. So I think that was important for me, partly because as one of the experts who was interviewed said, the reason why Israel did that was because the kind of operation it was going to mount, this genocidal war, it needed to, in the eyes of the world, make sure, prove that Israel is justified in going after Hamas in the way it did to justify its genocide. And that came out clear. But I think what has undermined Israel's position is now that all this evidence has come out, no one can take Israel's word again. No one can believe Israel when it says that it's attacking Shifa because of Hamas is hiding behind the hospital or taking civilians as human shield. So we can never believe Israel anymore, given the level of the lie that was perpetrated from the top of Israeli governance and also US administration to justify the genocide. And that, I think, for a lot of people is what is very concerning, and because of the manner in which it was done.
Yes, well,
Uh,
sorry, please go ahead.
yeah, so I think that stood out for me, and that came out really clearly. And it's important, especially when you're going to war, not to lie in such a brazen manner, to lie and justify in support of a genocide. And that, I think, was quite shocking. Al Jazeera clearly, the documentary laid that out. Israel could have, if it wanted to, just show the real life footage and the human rights abuse and the attack that took place, but instead it opted to mount this propaganda, and that, I think, is what has caused Israel to lose all credibility when it comes to its claims, its numbers in this bombardment of Gaza.
Yes, I think you're entirely right, or perhaps I should add, theoretically, you're entirely right, because Israeli mendacity and fabrication and war propaganda has reached such a level that no one really takes them seriously anymore, except some of the most influential media in the world. American Pravda, the New York Times, every time Israel makes a claim, for example, about mass rapes and command centers under Al Shifa Hospital and all the rest of it, they run detailed investigative reports that purport to demonstrate the veracity of Israeli claims. And then after the damage is done, and it's too late to have any influence on decision making, then they slowly and gradually begin to backtrack, as they're doing now about their major quote unquote investigative piece about systematic organized rape. What was it? Screams Without Words, which has been, I think, aptly renamed Screams Without Evidence. The other thing that strikes me, exactly as you say, is that every party in conflict engages in war propaganda. And the purpose of war propaganda is usually either to confuse rather than convince, or to convince using basing a narrative around at least a kernel of truth. What we've seen now with Israel, it's just completely over the top. So, for example, there's imminent famine in the Gaza Strip. So instead of, for example, saying that Israel is seeking to work with humanitarian agencies to ensure that food gets in or whatever. They say, no, actually, we, Israel, are delivering food to the Palestinians, and we're doing it in greater amounts than we're entering before October 7th. So the disconnect between myth and fact is just so massive and huge that it really needs a very substantial ideological investment in Israel and its genocide to even begin to take their propaganda seriously.
And on that, you're absolutely right there. Everyone knows there's a famine happening right now. British Foreign Secretary David Cameron accused Israel of hindering the flow of aids into Gaza. And this week, also the IPC, the Famine Review Committee, the integrated, they have an integrated phase classification on which category of famine group is in. Palestinians are in the highest stage of an imminent famine. And that's the conclusion of the IPC. And this dispute it has turned quite bizarre with the the government spokesperson, Elon Levy. He was apparently suspended, so he was suspended because he challenged the British Foreign Secretary over his accusation that Israel is hindering the flow of aid. So which goes to show that if the US wanted to, or the UK wanted to exert power over the Israelis, it can do that. This is an example of that. But that aside, how significant is the IPC's intervention in this? This is a preeminent organization monitoring famine across the world. Now it's come out and said that Palestinians in Gaza are facing an imminent famine. And Israel, of course, as you mentioned, it's in complete denial about the reality on the ground.
Yeah, well, it depends. I mean, if you're a rational human being who forms opinions and conclusions on the basis of evidence and on the basis of facts and analysis and conclusion presented by leading specialists in a field, then it's very significant, and I would argue very convincing, because this isn't the president of Egypt or some minor bureaucrat in the European Union. No, as you said, this is an IPC. The world's leading authority on such matters is presenting voluminous evidence to present its case in a very convincing manner. But if you're Israel or one of its flunkies, then you begin to ask questions like, well, if there was a Holocaust, where is the memo written by Hitler calling on the SS to exterminate all the Jews? It's that kind of level of denialism, and you begin to accuse these professionals of being motivated by anti-Semitism, being Hamas operatives, and all these other crazy responses. As you said, Levy has been sent out to pasture, but he's still as active as ever. And among his flunkies and people who have taken a decision to be blind to the reality, because the only truth they will accept is that which emanates directly from those responsible for this genocidal assault and incipient famine, or endorsed by them, he's still speaking the gospel truth.
Yeah, I want to now turn our attention to a number of big shifts on the global arena with regards to Israel and Palestine. We'll get to the UN resolution later on, but let's begin with some of the shifts within Israel's traditional allies. Canada, for example, took the unimaginable step last week of halting arms exports to Israel, joining Holland, Japan, Spain, and Belgium. UK Labour Party leader Keir Starmer, he came out and said that there should be an imminent ceasefire. And when he was asked, why didn't you ask for that before, knowing that this is what's going to happen, his justification was simply, oh, facts on the grounds have changed, and therefore I've changed my position on this. That was basically his argument. And I wanted to read a quote from an article in The Economist. Economist, as everyone knows, is a very pro-Israeli publication, but it had a front cover of its
Sorry, it
magazine.
wasn't always so, I should add.
Okay, it wasn't always so. So in this week, it has a front cover with Israel alone, and it says that, and I quote, that ceasefire talks will fail. That could leave Israel locked in the bleakest trajectory of its 75-year existence, featuring endless occupation, hard right politics, and isolation. Today, many Israelis are in denial about this, about a political reckoning that will come eventually. It will determine not only the fate of Palestinians, but also whether Israel thrives in the next 75 years, end quote. So I think on the global stage, there's been a lot of shifts, and also in the views and attitudes of the, I would say, a lot of the media, the economists in this case. So do you think there is a recalibration that's now taking place amongst key traditional allies of Israel, and also traditionally pro-Israeli outlets like The Economist?
Well, I think it's interesting, particularly your observations regarding shifts in state policy, because let's not forget, these governments are motivated neither by any form of sympathy or solidarity with the Palestinian people, who they tend to view as irrelevant and expendable human scum, nor are they necessarily, nor are they, for that matter, motivated by any kind of hostility to Israel or opposition to its policies. What we're seeing, I think, is a gradual shift, gradual but nevertheless more rapid than I had anticipated, where you have these governments who tend to be, first of all, terrified of the United States, and second of all, terrified, traditionally terrified of the Israel lobby and Israel supporters in their respective countries, who in the past have always pledged loyalty or at least acquiescence to Israel's most extreme policies because it was in their partisan political interests to do so, was, let's call it, the path of least resistance, who now really for the first time in 75 years are beginning to shift their attitudes and their policies, however gradually, I think primarily out of self-interest and on the basis of electoral considerations. So you take someone like Keir Starmer, you know, with his whole concocted campaign against systematic anti-Semitism in his own party, as he called it. And this is someone who basically saw that hitching his cart to Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, and Smotrich was essential to gaining power in the United Kingdom in the next election, and is now shifting his position because he's concerned that unless he distances himself from Israel, he may not have as easy of a path to 10 Downing Street as he anticipated. And you're seeing this in other countries. Holland, I think, is a bit of an anomaly here. In Holland, you have the outgoing Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, who wants to become the next Secretary General of NATO and already has US and UK support for that, who, as part of his campaign, has suppressed legal opinions from the foreign ministry, who has ensured there is absolutely no daylight between Dutch and US policy towards a genocide in Gaza, but whose government was nevertheless ordered by the Dutch courts to cease supplying spare parts for F-35 jet fighters to Israel because of the human rights implications. And although the Dutch government has said it respects this legal ruling, there are continuing suspicions yet to be confirmed, but serious suspicions nonetheless, that the Netherlands is continuing to supply these spare parts to Israel, but indirectly rather than directly. That's just a detail, but I think the broader picture here is that we appear to be entering an era in the politics of Western states, which have been, of course, Israel's sponsors since the last century, an era in which blind support for Israel is becoming an electoral and political burden rather than an asset. And that, I think, is an extraordinarily important transformation. It's a slow and gradual one, but one to keep an eye on nonetheless.
Yeah, I think Canada and Holland withholding arms shipments to Israel doesn't really make much of a difference on the ground, because the overwhelming majority, I think something like 95% or more of the arms and the munitions delivered is from the US and Germany. So it doesn't really make much of a difference on the ground. And the US position on this has been really bizarre. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. On the one hand, you had Blinken last week warning Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his war cabinet in a meeting on Friday that Israel's security and its place in the world are in peril, and you might not realize it until it's too late. And that's his direct quote. And he went on to say that you, Israel, need a coherent plan, or either you're going to be stuck in Gaza. But Netanyahu went on to say, if we need to, we'll go it alone. Of course, Israel will never go it alone, knowing that America will always be on its side. But I thought that was quite an interesting exchange, especially given what is the US said later on with regards to the Security Council resolution ceasefire vote, and also another topic which we will discuss, which is Biden's office concluding that Israel is not committing war crimes, human rights abuse. So we'll get to that. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that exchange between Netanyahu and Blinken. That Blinken himself is warning that Israel is becoming a pariah and it's going to be too late for you unless you find a coherent plan in Gaza.
Well, this according to reports I've seen, this appears to be also related to differences within the U.S. leadership. I think first we need to clarify that all these positions emanating from Washington have one and only one purpose, which is what's determining what's best for the United States and determining what's best for Israel. And more often than not, there's a failure to make any distinction between what is best for the United States and what is best for Israel. These are seen almost as coterminous. The Palestinians, of course, don't figure into this equation at all, as I mentioned previously, particularly in this administration, but in U.S. Politics generally, they're seen as irrelevant and expendable human scum. Now, what appears to have happened is that Biden, as we know, is very personally invested in Israel. He proudly proclaims himself to be a Zionist. He came of political age when Israel was viewed in the U.S. As one of Washington's major Cold War assets globally, and particularly in the Middle East. And he has this, I think, visceral, emotional, political, ideological, passionate attachment to Israel that we've really never seen from any previous U.S. president. Blinken, while largely sharing the same outlook, has been to the Middle East on multiple occasions since October 7th, and is probably seeing U.S. influence in the region drain away before his very eyes. And this appears to have come to a head with regard to the U.S. position on an Israeli ground operation in Rafah. And what is being suggested is that Biden has basically signed off on it, provided Israel meets certain conditions. But Blinken has come to the conclusion that any Israeli ground operation in Rafah would be a disaster, not only for Israel in the terms that that he's expressed, that you just recounted, but would also do additional significant damage to the U.S. Position and influence in the region and even globally. And I think that's the background against which we need to assess these statements.
Yeah, and another bit of context is the response to the UN Security Council resolution, and I want to speak about that. So that's the big news from yesterday. The Security Council passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire for Ramadan, and the US abstained, and since it's done everything it can to downplay the resolution, saying that it's non-binding, Israel can carry on doing what it's doing. That's the message from the White House. And at the same time, the US has determined that Israel is in compliance with President Joe Biden's national security memorandum. Basically, that Israel is supposed to comply with international law and US law before it could be given weapons. And Israel apparently has given assurances that it is abiding by US laws, international law, and the White House has basically accepted that. And Biden is convinced that Israel is not breaking any US laws. And I found that quite bizarre, especially in a week where we've mentioned the famine, we've mentioned the UN resolution, and within that context, you have the White House downplaying the resolution at the same time, saying that it has been given reassurances by Israel that Israel is not violating any US law. So I found that very, very puzzling.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting Security Council resolution. I would say it's significant and important in particular respects. It also, of course, will change nothing on the ground, not least because of the points you just raised. The U.S., as you know, has vetoed 3 Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. It has voted against several resolutions in the General Assembly calling for the same. What happened this time is that this was not a resolution proposed by Algeria on behalf of the Arab group. This was not a resolution that was submitted by Russia and or China. This was a resolution that was drafted by the elected 10 members of the Security Council resolution. So in other words, states from every region in the world, states with very different governments and attitudes towards this conflict, who collectively came to the conclusion that this situation cannot be allowed to continue. And the elected 10, I should point out, includes on this occasion very close US allies like Japan, like South Korea, like Ecuador also, I believe. And on that basis, it became clear that it was going to be another 14-1 vote with the US vetoing. Now, what happened are several things. First of all, the US succeeded in after after the draft had been finalized, the US went back for one more negotiation to have the term permanent ceasefire replaced by, I think it was a lasting and sustainable ceasefire. So, in other words, to water it down. And of course, the resolution calls for a ceasefire during the month of Ramadan, which ends, I think, around the 10th of April, leading to a lasting and sustainable ceasefire. So, in other words, the United States government managed to procrastinate and play the long game until halfway through the month of Ramadan before acceding to a ceasefire resolution for that particular month. The US got its way on that point. The resolution was passed, 14 votes in favor. the U.S. abstained because, of course, it still can't bring itself to vote for anything that concerns preservation of Palestinian lives or rights. And then the damage control immediately began. First, the United States claimed that because this resolution was not passed under Chapter 7, that it is non-binding, and basically Israel is free to ignore this resolution if it so chooses. Well, um, if you look at the UN Charter, every UN Security Council resolution is by definition binding not only on the members of the Security Council, but binding on each and every member state of the United Nations. Secondly, there's a ruling from the International Court of Justice, which is the highest authority and ultimate arbiter of any procedures or rules related to the United Nations, a ruling from 1970, which states explicitly that there is no hierarchy among UN Security Council resolutions, and they are all equally binding. And so, you know, the United States and the United Kingdom have tried to, in the past, to promote this view that some resolutions are more equal than others, that some are more binding than others. But the other interesting thing here is that those who drafted this resolution used the exact same wording of a previous Security Council resolution regarding the urgency of a ceasefire in Syria several years ago, which the US not only voted for, but insisted was binding upon the government of Syria. But now all of a sudden, it's do as you please. So first there was that. Secondly, as you noted, the White House trotted out its thoroughly discredited spokesperson, and I believe the State Department did the same, who made explicitly clear our policy is unchanged. This does not require Israel to change its policy. Basically, things can continue as they are. Unless there be any doubt about US policy and intentions, on that very same day, the White House came out with a determination, as you mentioned, that Israel is using the weapons supplied to it by the United States in accordance not just with international law, but in accordance with US domestic regulations, which, if they were applied correctly, would prohibit the supply of weapons to states that engage in deliberate mass killings of civilians, or when those or weapons can also not be applied to a state that is preventing the provision of US humanitarian assistance. So basically, the US is saying, we've looked at how Israel is conducting this war, and we're perfectly comfortable with the way our weapons are being used in the Gaza Strip. We're fine with it, nothing to see here. Okay, there's a few tens of thousands dead and a genocide case in the International Court of Justice, but let's move on and continue.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders came out strongly against that, and he said the State Department's position on this, that Israel is using US weapons according to US domestic law, makes a mockery of US law. That's basically what he said. Returning to the UN Security Council resolution, I wanted to get your thoughts on another aspect of that. Hamas came out strongly in support of the resolution, and Israel has condemned it. Israel has criticized the US for abstaining. I found that quite strange, partly because the US itself is saying this resolution is meaningless. On the ground, it has no real impact on the ground. So why has Israel come out condemning its key ally in the way it has, given that in their view, this resolution is meaningless?
Yes, well, just one more point on that resolution and the U.S. response. A key issue for those who drafted this resolution was that was that a ceasefire should be a demand rather than an aspiration, using convoluted, meaningless language, as was the case with the resolution drafted by the US last week that was vetoed by Russia and China. So it explicitly demands an immediate ceasefire. And secondly, it also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. But crucially, these two demands are independent of each other. In other words, one is not a precondition for the other. And that was a main point of contention for the US. It wanted to connect them together. It lost, but nevertheless, as soon as the resolution passed, it gave its own interpretation and said actually they are connected. Regarding the Israeli response, my own view is that it's the hallmark of an irrational state, which has gone off the reservation when it can no longer distinguish between its closest and most important allies on whom it is utterly dependent on the one hand, and its fiercest adversaries and enemies on the other. And if you look at the way that Israel responded to the US abstention, it's a kind of language that most states, Western states, for example, might use against Russia, perhaps not even China, but basically um, um, characterizing the United States as an enemy of Israel, as an ally of Israel's enemies. I mean, it's just, it's impossible to wrap your head around this unless you accept that this has become a thoroughly irrational state on the one hand, and secondly, that Netanyahu considers that this will help him in domestic political terms. So imagine, here you have an Israeli leader who thinks that picking a fight with the state on whom his own is utterly dependent, not only for its ability, very existence, has come to the conclusion that it's in his political interest to pick a fight with not only the United States, but with the self-proclaimed Zionist Joe Biden of all people. He thinks it's in his political interest, and he may well be right, because Israeli society itself is also becoming increasingly loopy.
Mm. I mentioned Hamas and the support of the Security Council resolution. And Hamas has previously also advocated for the International Criminal Court to investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I mentioned this in light of a report that's basically gone under the radar. The US passed a bill threatening to cut off funding from the Palestinian Authority if the Palestinians seek to obtain UN membership or actively support an ICC investigation into allegations of war crimes, crimes against humanity against Israeli nationals. I found that quite bizarre, trying to close all avenues for the Palestinian Authority, not Hamas, Palestinian Authority, from seeking any redemptive measures. But what the question, I guess, is: do you think the PA will even pay attention to this threat in this new bill? That if it goes to the ICC, they will cut funding, and I think is there a possibility if the US was to cut funding, the other countries around the world will seek to fund the PA? How do you think this will play out in the coming months if the PA seeks to go to the ICC?
Well, there's an old saying that the United States is often more pro-Israel than Israel itself. And this, I think, is a perfect example of that. I should add, these aren't new issues. Already around 10, 15 years ago, when the PLO first went to the United Nations seeking recognition of Palestinian statehood, the U.S. Congress adopted a law that requires the United States to withdraw from and terminate funding to any UN agency that accepts the state of Palestine as a member. And there were several instances in which this, in fact, happened. In my view, the Palestinian leadership made the terrible mistake of not seeking to join those UN agencies that genuinely matter to the United States, such as, I can't remember its name, but the International Agency for Patents and Copyright. I think the first priority for the Palestinians should have been to join that agency and call the American bluff, and have them withdraw from an agency whose mandate is very near and dear to not only the United States government, but also the plutocrats that run that country. In terms of what in terms of your question, yes, it's now also the ICC. Now, the question here is that the Palestinian Authority, State of Palestine, it has already been involved for almost a decade in seeking to persuade the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and particularly its current and visible prosecutor, Karim Khan, to fulfill their mandate and their responsibility. So if the US wants to implement this law, it should immediately terminate all funding to the Palestinian Authority. If it doesn't do so, then its threats are meaningless. But if it does so, it should also prepare for the consequences, which are likely going to be a collapse of the Palestinian Authority, because although the US does not directly fund the Palestinian Authority, again, because of previous laws and so on, there is a lot of covert and indirect support, particularly to the Palestinian security forces, its intelligence agencies, and so on. And the motivation for this US support is not Palestinian rights or preparing Palestinians for statehood or Palestinian democracy or any of that nonsense. US support to the Palestinians has one motivation and one objective alone, which is making the occupied territories safe for permanent Israeli occupation and settlement expansion, and ultimately annexation. That is really ultimately the only reason that there is any US assistance to the Palestinian Authority. So from my point of view, I think the US making good on its word and severing all assistance to the Palestinian security forces would be a most welcome thing.
And to add to that, I mean, it's just further evidence that all avenues for Palestinians to resist their occupiers has been blocked. Whether it be armed resistance, whether it be legal measures, whether it be going to the ICC, ICJ, every avenue they pursue, there's always a penalty that's attached to them pursuing any form of resistance.
Precisely. I mean, Palestinians have no right to oppose Israeli policy. The way they usually say these things is, well, we oppose terrorism. Where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Where's the Palestinian this? Where's the Palestinian that? But then whenever they're presented with popular or nonviolent forms of resistance to Israel, whether, as you said, it's going to the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, efforts to boycott Israel, that all is punished as well. So again, I think it's important to recognize the Western problem with Palestinian opposition to Israel. It has nothing to do with armed resistance. They oppose any Palestinian opposition to Israeli destruction of Palestinian society as a matter of principle. It can be violent, it can be non-violent. You know, if Palestinians, there is nothing Palestinians can ever do to resist Israeli occupation that will be supported by Israel's Western sponsors. There never has been, there isn't, there never will be. And I think we should get over this illusion that the West's real problem is with, you know, Palestinians targeting civilians, or Palestinians taking up arms, or suicide bombings. Yes, they do oppose those things. But ultimately, the reason they oppose those things is not because they're violations of the laws of war and all the rest of it. They oppose any Palestinian opposition, full stop.
Yeah, you mentioned Gandhi, and I find a lot of people who ask that question, I find it very puzzling, partly because I've lost count of the number of Palestinians that have been on hunger strikes, and on hunger strike for periods much longer than Gandhi ever did. And the overwhelming majority of Palestinian resistance is peaceful, whether it be hunger strikes or the BDS. But instead of accepting them as peaceful resistance, what you see, especially with BDS in the US in particular, is efforts
Denounce
to
the terrorism and anti-Semitism.
anti-Semitism, change the laws of the country to denounce it as anti-Semitic, and that's yeah.
I mean, and sorry to interrupt you, but in Texas, it's entirely legal to get up in public and call for the destruction of the United States, but it's illegal to call for the destruction of Israel. Imagine, this country has gone so bonkers, you know, that it protects the interests of a foreign state more than it protects its own existence.
Yes, and public contracts in Texas and other states, there's what you call an Israeli loyalty pledge. Unless you
Yes.
pledge loyalty that you will not boycott Israel, you will not get those
You don't
contracts.
have to pledge loyalty to the United States. You're perfectly free to work for these state governments without giving any opinion about the United States. But God forbid you don't pledge loyalty to Israel, you're screwed.
Yeah, I think we'll have a longer conversation about that. I want to end with the horrific attacks in Moscow concert hall, which at least 137 people have been killed, and that for me raised a number of questions. Putting aside the horrible situation, the claim by the Israeli that Hamas is ISIS, ISIS is Hamas. I mean, Hamas enjoys really good relations with Russia. Moscow, in fact, does not consider Hamas a terror organization, terror group, nor does China, and instead sees it as a liberation movement. And Hamas, let's not also forget, it fought against ISIS and stamped out the group from Gaza. So the question is, how much of a mistake is it, to lump Hamas and ISIS as Netanyahu, as some of the right-wing media have been trying to do? How much of a mistake and an error is this to lump the two groups together?
Well, it depends what you mean by mistake. I mean, from a propaganda perspective, Netanyahu, Biden, and that whole crew have not just equated Hamas with ISIS. They've indicated that in their perspective, Hamas is much worse than ISIS. Similarly, you have dedicated Zionists who not only equate Palestinians with the Nazis, but say that the Palestinians are in fact much worse than the Nazis. So from that perspective, these are things that used to resonate quite well with Western publics. They have very little purchase in the international community as such, but in the West, they've been effective. And with ISIS, I think initially it was quite effective because not only do most people in the West know what ISIS is, but when you couple these equivalencies and denunciations with concocted fabrications about babies being beheaded and roasted in ovens and hung from clotheslines, and pregnant women being disemboweled, and necrophilia and all this other stuff, I think it convinced quite a lot of people. But if you want to analyze it rationally, yeah, Hamas and ISIS are, okay, they're both Islamist organizations, but to draw any equivalency between them would be like saying that, well, the Vatican and the Lord's Resistance Army are both Christian, therefore the Vatican is a Lord's Resistance Army. It's just completely insane stuff, which shows you the level to which Israel and its flunkies feel they need to go to maintain the initiative and trying to influence Western public opinion. Hamas is part of a regional organization, which is several decades older than Israel itself, I might add, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a mass movement that seeks to Islamize society and seize political power and achieve political power through a variety of means, including, as in the case of Hamas, free and fair democratic elections. Elsewhere, through, as in Egypt, also through elections and previously uprisings and so on. ISIS is a very different kettle of fish, of course. ISIS is a jihadi, takfiri organization. It's kind of the Islamist equivalent of Bush's famous statement, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And then ISIS, you're either with ISIS or you're an infidel, particularly if you're also a Muslim. And ISIS, of course, has pronounced Hamas as an organization and each of its individual members to be apostates and legitimate targets for violence and killings for a number of sins. Chief among them is Hamas's participation in democratic elections, Hamas's promotion of a nationalist rather than exclusively Islamist agenda, Hamas's failure, refusal, whatever you want to call it, to impose Sharia, Islamic law, as a sole source of law and legislation in the Gaza Strip after it seized power there, and a whole host of other mortal sins. So it's pure propaganda. It's intended as such. It's those making these claims know that they hold no water. But like comparing the PLO to the Nazis back in the day, those promoting these narratives apparently have come to the conclusion that they work quite well in seeking to influence Western public opinion. And in fairness, I think initially, with Biden and Netanyahu and their friends Ben Gvir and Smotrich and Frau Genocide, Ursula von der Leyen, and others saying, Hamas is ISIS, Hamas is worse than ISIS. I think it worked for a couple of weeks, but once the 10,000th Palestinian child was blown to smithereens in the Gaza Strip, I think it's become somewhat less effective. And I think not only the international community, but increasingly public opinion in the West is also beginning to realize, well, there are barbarians, there are savages at work here, and they fly advanced Western aircraft. They use Western artillery shells and so on.
Yes, I think one of the most grotesque pieces of propaganda, again, is to cultivate and prime the climate in the West for the genocide. Was right at the beginning, a number of articles that were published to say Hamas is worse than the Nazis, worse than Hitler. Many Jews took, was really offended by that and said, how can you compare the two? How can you compare the two? But there was a real drive.
If I may just interrupt, I think we have to understand that one of the tenets of Zionism and of Israeli policy is that anything and everything will always be subordinated to the promotion of the establishment and maintenance of a Jewish state in Palestine. And we saw this during the 1940s with the Holocaust, where the agenda of establishing a Jewish state consistently, without exception, took precedence over seeking to assist and rescue Jews living under the Nazis' boot. And we see it today, where Israel quite freely embraces neo-Nazis as its best friends in Europe, and basically gives them a kosher certificate in terms of their anti-Semitism, and then denounces progressives as anti-Semites simply because they oppose Israeli policies. And with this, belittling the Holocaust, making it subordinate to promoting Israel's agenda, there's really nothing new here for those who look into the history.
On that note, Moin, we'll finish today's review. That was my guest, Moin Rabbani. And thank you for tuning in. And see you next week for another episode of Memo's Review with me, Naseem Ahmed, and Moin Rabbani. Bye-bye.